Hi Excel lovers, my name is Lenny Wu. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk about the 5 extreme hacks of pivot tables. They include how to connect tables without using VLOOKUP, how to build a dynamic financial report on a pivot table, and how to break free of pivot tables. Now let's get started. Extreme pivot table hacks. Number 1. How to collapse 12 months data into one field. Oftentimes, the data we receive from the system is in a table format, like financial statements by 12 months. If the data is already in the table format, it is very hard for you to pivot that into a pivot table. So the answer is unpivoting the table format of the data by using Power Query. Now suppose we have the system extract for total sales forecast by 12 months, by regions. This is already in a table format. And now let's see how we can pivot this data. Let's select any cell in the table, Alt-NV to generate a pivot table. Let's click OK. Now we are going to drag and drop the forecast into the value panel and the region into rows as we did before. So what it means is you can only drag and drop the January 20th as values into the value panel. So what about February, March, April? We'll have to do the same by drag and drop each and every into the value panel. What is drag? This is too manual and it takes a lot of time. Or you can simply check these other months, but it's still too manual. So how can we convert that table format into a regular data format? Let's use Power Pivot. Now let's go back to forecast. First, convert this into a table by press Ctrl and the letter T. Let's click OK. So let's go to Data, Get and Transform Data. So this Get and Transform Data is actually the Power Query module that is seamlessly built into Excel. So let's check From Table or Range since we already have the table set up. Click the button and that will bring you into the Power Query editor. Now we have the region 12 months data, because pivot table can automatically generate the grand total column. So let's delete the total column. And now we have the 12 months period selected. Let's go to Transform, Unpivot Columns. And all of a sudden, it unpivot all periods into one column. Jan 20, Feb 20, March 20, and all the values into one column, which is perfect for pivot table. Now let's change the column header to period and state this column not as text but as date. Now once this is done, let's assign a name to, for example, forecast. Done. Once this is done, let's click Home, Close and Load. Now we are brought into a new tab with the converted data by Power Query. In this format, it is very easy for us to do the pivot table. So let's click any cell in this Power Query table and press and hold Alt and then NV to generate a new pivot table. Click OK. Now with this setup, it's very easy to drag and drop. Look familiar, right? Region to rows, period to columns, and values to values. Now with the new pivot table analyze, insert a slicer. We can insert a slicer for the months. Click OK. Now all of a sudden, you have a slicer for the months. You can select 3 months or simply 1 month. Or you can click the cross sign to clear the filter. Now with Power Query, we can easily convert the data from table format to regular data format which is easy for you to build your pivot table. Perfect. Extreme pivot table hacks. Number 2, how to use Power Pivot without opening Power Pivot. Power Pivot is the recent addition to the Excel family. It is considered one of the powerful tools to perform big data analysis. However, for those who are not quite familiar with Power Pivot but still want to use certain functions from Power Pivot, you can use Data Model, which is a light version of Power Pivot. But there are some downsides if you choose to use Power Pivot. First, the calculated field or items will not be functioning. Why? Because Power Pivot has its own calculation called DAX formulas, or data analysis expressions. Also, the group and onGroup will not be functioning, so you have to use dimension mapping in order to group those fields. Now let's go to Excel to see how you can build the data model. Now in Excel, if you do have the Power Pivot tab, you can easily click the table and click Add to Data Model button. Very simple, because that's the way how you can activate Power Pivot. For those who do not have this Power Pivot set up yet, no problem. Let's simply use conventional pivot table setup. Let's click anywhere in the table and then press and hold Alt and then NV to generate the pivot table. Go to the bottom and check this box, say add this data to the data model, and click OK. And by doing that, you add the data into the data model or the light version of Power Pivot. As you may notice, the pivot table fields looks a bit different from the conventional pivot table. It shows active and all. So active right now is the data model we just added, and we are going to do the same for product, customer, and region. And after we done that, and let's click all, and you can see all your table have been added to the data model. Perfect. Extreme pivot table hacks. Number 3, how to connect tables without using VLOOKUP. As you may recall, in conventional pivot table, if we want to join different tables, we can use the Excel formulas VLOOKUP or the formula groups index match. But with Power Pivot or the DAX model, we can connect the tables without using VLOOKUP. And that is the reason why I show you the data model in the first place, because we are going to connect different tables without using VLOOKUP. We can't do that inside regular pivot table. We can only do that in data model. Okay, to connect tables without using VLOOKUP, we can use the relationships for the data model. Now let me show you how. Now I'm going to show you, rather than using VLOOKUP, let's use relationships to connect different tables. So let's delete all these columns for the VLOOKUPs, and we are going to use relationship to connect these tables. Let's go to the pivot table and refresh. Now check this out. Suppose we drag and drop the sales to the values table, and we want to generate a pivot table for the total sales by category. We don't have category in F order, so we need to pull the category from the product table. Now let's drag and drop category. All of a sudden, you can see the total sales are the same for furniture, office supplies, and technology. And the grand total is the same, which doesn't look like right. If you look at the pivot table fields, there's a warning window and says relationship between tables may be needed, meaning that we have not set up the relationship between the tables yet. So that's why Excel cannot generate a proper pivot table for the total sales by category. Not a problem. Let's auto-detect first. If Excel cannot auto-detect, let's do create later. Let's click auto-detect. Excel all of a sudden found one new relationship and created it for you. And let's say close. And let's see if Excel did the job. Once we click the close, all of a sudden we have the total sales by category presented correct. How lovely is that? So by using relationships, we no longer need to use VLOOKUP to connect different tables. Perfect. Extreme pivot table hacks. Number 4. How to build a dynamic financial report based on a pivot table. As we know, pivot table is notorious for its rigidity. It's very difficult to insert an empty cell or an empty row. So we can set up a financial report and then link the data to the pivot table. How can we do that? We can use the formula called get pivot data. Now let's go to Excel to see an example. Now in Excel, suppose we have a pivot table for total sales by region and by year. We want to differentiate the year for 2019 as actual, 2020 as forecast, 2021 and 2022 as budget. But we don't have the flexibility of adding those words inside a pivot table, let alone insert a empty row. For example, in the pivot table, let's insert a row, and pivot table will not allow that. So pivot table is very, very rigid, as I said before. So how to make a flexible financial report based on this pivot table? We can create a dummy financial report showing all the format that you need and then link the data to the original pivot table. For example, in cell I7, let's type in equal to this cell 157,390. When you click that cell, Excel gives you a new formula called get pivot data. Sales table is A5, which refers to this pivot table, and then region refers to Africa, and years is 2019. So once we press enter, we got the same number that is linked to the pivot table. Whenever you update your pivot data, the pivot table will refresh automatically, and so will your financial report. But here is a catch. I want to drag this down, but the number stuck with Africa for 2019, which I don't want. So let me click Ctrl Z to go back. So in order for me to drag the formula to the right and bottom, I need to customize this formula a little bit. So in the formula, let me remove the Africa hard-coded word. Let's link to cell H7. And let's press F4 to lock the column so that when we drag to the right, it's still fixed to this column H. And we are going to do the same for the year 2019, which is in the row of I5. Let's press F4 2 times to lock the row so that when you drag down, it will still link to row 5. Now, we do not need to change A5 because that refers to the pivot table. Okay, so everything looks like right. Let's press enter. And then now let's drag this formula to the right, and looks like everything is correct, and down. And we got the same total that matched the total of the pivot table. And best yet, this table is flexible. We can add any row. For example, let's add a row and shift the cells down and click OK. And let me mark this empty row to show that this is not a pivot table, but a regular table, which is flexible for you to add any row, any cell, or change any words for that table. In summary, by using the getPivotData formula, we can quickly transform a rigid pivot table into a regular table for financial report, which is flexible for any future customization. Perfect. Extreme pivot table hacks number 5. How to break free of pivot table. As we learned before, we use getPivotData to convert a rigid pivot table into a regular reporting table. But we still need to build two tables. One is pivot table, the second one is a regular reporting table. So is there a way to simply use one pivot table to report, but still can make it easy to customize the formatting? The answer is yes. So rather than using getPivotData, we use the formula CubeValue. And best yet, it is even driven by slicers and timeline. The only downside is that it works only with data model. Now you understand why we learned data model in early part of this slide. Now let's go to Excel to see how we can set this up. Now in Excel, let's first build a pivot table out of data model. We understand that this CubeValue formula will only work with a data model. Now let's build a pivot table by region and by segment. Let's go to the F order data, drag and drop cells to the values panel, and then let's go to regions and drag and drop region to the row panel. Then go to customer, drag and drop segment into column panel. Now let's first change the report layout from compact form to outline form to show the segment name and region name in the pivot table. Now next, let's add a slicer and a timeline. In pivot table analyze, insert slicer, subcategory, and click OK. Now you can select the slicer. The pivot table will reflect the changes. Now let's clear out the filter in the slicer. Next, we are going to add a timeline. Let's go to pivot table analyze, insert timeline. We only have one field for the date, which is ordered date. Let's click OK. Now this is to demonstrate that once we break the pivot table into a regular table, these slicers will still function. Now let's click the pivot table, go to pivot table analyze. In calculations panel, there's a button for OLAP tools. OLAP is short for online analytical processing. Basically, it is a multi-dimension array of data. So that's another word for data model. Now let's click the OLAP tools. There's one line that is not hidden. It said convert to formulas. So by clicking convert to formulas, we will be effectively convert this pivot table into a regular reporting table, making it easier for you to customize the formatting and layout. Now let's click convert to formulas. Check this out. After a certain calculation, the pivot table disappears. In its place, if you click any cell, it has the new formula called CubeValue, this workbook data model, and it will be driven by the slicer, subcategory, and timeline order date. So if you click the slicer, for example, accessories, and your table will still be running. But it's not a pivot table, it's just a regular table, so that you can insert any row and push the numbers down. Let's add a color in there just to show that this is not a pivot table, but a regular table. Once you've done that, you can quickly change the format, for example, and shift the rows to another place and delete any rows without making any changes. Or you can simply select the timeline, for example, February of 2019, and your table will also automatically calculate. In summary, by using the cube formula, we effectively break the pivot table into a regular reporting table which can still be driven by slicer and timeline. How lovely is that? So to sum up, in this tutorial we learned 5 extreme pivot table hacks. They are: how to collapse 12 months data into one field. 2. How to use Power Pivot without opening Power Pivot. 3rd, how to connect tables without using VLOOKUP. 4th, how to build a dynamic financial report on a pivot table. And last, how to break free of pivot tables. Q&A. Feel free to connect and share with me via my LinkedIn, email, or website. Happy learning!